poor ranchers saved 2 giant Apache sisters. Next day, their chief returned with a shocking decision. The storm had passed, but what Ezekiel Marsh found in his yard defied all logic. 2 Apache women lay unconscious near his dying cattle. But these weren't ordinary women. They were giants among their people, each standing taller than most men when upright. The shorter one still towered over 6 FD, her powerful frame built for warfare and survival. The taller one was massive, nearly 7 FD of solid muscle and bone, her shoulders broader than any settler Ezekiel had ever seen. Apache women this size were legends whispered around frontier fires. Warrior daughters of chiefs trained from birth to fight like men, but carrying the sacred responsibility of continuing bloodlines. They never traveled alone. They never appeared on failing ranches without entire war parties following behind. The giant women wore intricate beadwork that marked them as highborn, their jewelry worth more than Ezekiel's entire property. Blood seeped through the shorter one's torn clothing, while the taller one's breathing came in labored gasps. Both had taken serious injuries fleeing from something, or someone dangerous enough to separate them from their protection. Every survival instinct Ezekiel possessed screamed one truth. Helping Apache meant death for settlers like him. That was the iron law of this unforgiving frontier. But when the massive woman's eyes opened and locked onto his, Ezekiel saw something that shattered every assumption he'd held about Apache warriors. Not fury or hatred, but desperate human fear, the same terror he'd felt watching his ranch slowly die. Knowing he was powerless to stop it, she tried to speak, her voice deep and strong despite her injuries, but managed only a whisper in her native tongue before consciousness faded again. Standing over 2 fallen giants who could crush him with their bare hands, Ezekiel realized that what he did in the next few minutes would either mark him as the biggest fool on the frontier or reveal a strength he never knew he possessed. The choice that would change everything came down to 3 minutes and 2 dying giants. Ezekiel knelt beside the unconscious Apache women, his hands trembling as he assessed their injuries. Even lying down, their size was intimidating. The shorter one's frame stretched nearly 6 and 1/2 FD. Her muscled arms thicker than most men's legs. The taller one was a true giant, probably close to 7 feet tall. Her broad shoulders spanning wider than Ezekiel's doorway. Both carried the lean muscle of trained warriors, their bodies built for combat and survival in harsh frontier conditions. The shorter giant had taken something sharp to her ribs, maybe a branch, maybe something worse. Dark blood stained the earth beneath her massive frame, and her breathing rattled with each exhale. The taller one had a gash across her forehead, but her eyes remained alert, watching his every move with dangerous intensity that reminded him these women could snap his neck without effort. His ranch sat 15 mi from the nearest neighbor, 40 from town. Out here, helping Apache meant signing his own death warrant if other settlers discovered it. Men had been hanged for less, accused of collaboration, of choosing sides in a war that showed no mercy to either. The wounded giant's breathing grew shallower. Ezekiel had seen enough dying cattle to recognize the signs. She had maybe an hour, possibly less. Please, the conscious giant whispered in broken English, her voice carrying a deep, commanding tone that made clear she was accustomed to being obeyed. Help, sister. Ezekiel's throat tightened. The word sister hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own sister, Elizabeth, lost a fever 3 winters ago. But looking at these 2 massive women, he realized they represented something far more dangerous than family loyalty. They were Apache royalty, warrior daughters whose disappearance would bring entire war parties hunting for answers. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm approaching fast, and 2 giants would die in his yard if he did nothing. His neighbors would find the bodies eventually, probably assume he'd killed them defending his property. That story would protect him, maybe even earn him respect in town. But as he stared into the conscious woman's face, high cheekbones weathered by wind, dark eyes that held no pleading, only resigned acceptance, Ezekiel felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't about Apache or settlers. This was about 2 human beings bleeding out in front of him while he calculated the cost of his soul. Damn it, he muttered, sliding his arms under the wounded giant's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle beneath torn fabric, her unconscious body weighing more than a full-grown steer. The conscious giant struggled to her feet, swaying, but determined to help carry her sister, her own imposing height making Ezekiel feel like a child beside her. Together, they maneuvered toward his cabin. Each step felt like walking toward a cliff, the wounded woman's weight nearly crushing him despite the healthy giant's assistance. Behind them, the wind picked up, bringing the scent of rain and something else. Dust clouds that might mean riders approaching from the southern ridge. As they reached his doorway, Ezekiel realized his cabin entrance was too narrow for the wounded giant's broad shoulders. They would have to turn her sideways, careful not to worsen her injuries. "They come," the conscious giant whispered, her grip tightening on her sister's legs as she looked toward the horizon. Soon, the riders appeared on the ridge like wolves hunting wounded prey. Ezekiel pressed his back against the cabin wall, peering through a crack in his shutters. 5 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, scanning the valley below. Even from this distance, he could see the war paint streaking their faces and the rifles slung across their backs. "Your sister," he whispered to the conscious woman who had introduced herself as Ayanna. "What did she do? Why are they hunting you?" Ayanna's jaw tightened as she pressed a torn cloth against her sister's wound. It'll spoke against marriage. Chief's son wanted her as wife. She said no. The simplicity of it hit Ezekiel like a punch to the gut. A woman refusing marriage, and now both sisters were marked for death or capture. He thought of his own freedom to choose, to say no, to walk away from anything he didn't want. These women had no such luxury. Through the window, he watched the lead warrior raise his hand, pointing directly at Ezekiel's cabin. "They had found the blood trail. How many bullets you have?" Ayanna asked quietly, checking the knife on her belt with practiced efficiency. Ezekiel counted his ammunition. 12 rounds for his rifle, 6 for his pistol, against 5 experienced fighters who knew this terrain better than he ever would. Not enough, he admitted. Idle's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. She spoke in rapid Apache to her sister, her voice urgent despite her weakness. Ayanna's expression darkened with each word. "What did she say?" Ezekiel demanded. "Warriors not here for us." Ayanna said slowly, "Here for you." The words made no sense. Ezekiel had never wronged the Apache, never stolen their land or killed their people. His ranch sat on territory purchased legally from the territorial government, though he knew that meant little to those who had lived here first. "Why me?" Ayanna studied his face with those sharp dark eyes, as if measuring whether he could handle the truth. Outside, the warriors began their descent toward his cabin, moving with the deadly patience of experienced hunters. 3 moons ago, Apache girl found near death by river. White man brought her to our village, left her with medicine and food. Never gave name, never asked payment. She paused, watching recognition dawn in his eyes. "You remember now?" Ezekiel's breath caught. The girl by the creek may be 14 years old, half drowned and burning with fever. He'd found her while checking his water traps, stayed with her until she was strong enough to travel, then guided her toward Apache territory before riding away. He'd never told anyone, never expected gratitude or recognition. She was Chief's daughter, Ayanna continued. Chief Nalish swore blood debt to unnamed white man who saved her life. But some warriors say no debt owed to settlers. They come to test truth of her story. The sound of hoofbeat hats grew closer. Ezekiel realized with growing horror that this wasn't about the women he just sheltered. This was about a debt he never knew existed. A life he'd saved without understanding the consequences. Outside his door, the horses stopped. A voice called out in Apache, demanding and authoritative. Ayanna reached for his arm, her fingers strong and warm against his skin. "What you do next," she said quietly, "decides if you live as friend or die as enemy." The door shook under a heavy fist, and a voice called out in English. "White man, we know you inside. Come out now." Ezekiel's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. Beside him, Ayanna helped her sister sit up against the wall. Both women preparing for whatever violence might come. Idle was pale but alert, her dark eyes fixed on the door with grim determination. "I go out, they might kill me," Ezekiel whispered. "I stay inside, they'll burn us all out." "No burn," Ayanna said firmly. "They test your courage, not seek war. Apache way." Another voice joined the first, younger and more aggressive. "You help women who defy Chief's son. This makes you enemy of Apache people." Ezekiel recognized the trap. If he admitted to helping Ayanna and Idle, he sided against the chief's son. If he denied it, he lied to warriors who had already seen evidence of his actions. Either path led to death, but Ayanna's next words changed everything. "Tell them truth about River Girl. Tell them your name." She was asking him to claim the blood debt, to identify himself as the man who had saved the chief's daughter. It meant gambling his life on the word of a 14-year-old girl from months ago, betting that her father valued honor above politics. The pounding grew more insistent. Through the window, Ezekiel saw two warriors moving toward his small barn where his horses were kept. They were running out of time. "My name is Ezekiel Marsh," he called through the door, his voice carrying farther than he expected. 3 moons ago, I pulled Chief Nalish's daughter from the creek waters and brought her home safely." Silence fell outside. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the voice came again, it was different, older, more measured. "Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Bring the women." Ayanna nodded to him, then helped her sister to her feet. Idle swayed but stayed upright, her hand pressed against her bandaged ribs. Together, the 3 of them approached the door. Ezekiel lifted the wooden bar and pulled the door open. 5 Apache warriors sat their horses in his yard, wore paint sharp across their faces. But now he could see something else in their expressions, uncertainty, maybe even respect. The leader, a man with gray threading through his black hair, studied Ezekiel with intense curiosity. "You are smaller than daughter described," the warrior said. "She said white man was giant who fought river spirits." Despite everything, Ezekiel almost smiled. Children always made stories larger than life. "I'm just a rancher." Found her caught in fallen branches, helped her get free. The leader's gaze shifted to Ayanna and Idle. "These women brought shame to Chief's son. Why do you help them?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezekiel felt the weight of 3 lives balancing on his next words around him. The other warriors waited, hands resting on their weapons because they needed help. He said simply, "Same reason I helped your chief's daughter." The gray-haired warriors studied him for a long moment, then turned his horse toward the others. They spoke in rapid Apache, their voices low but urgent. When they finished, the leader looked back at Ezekiel with something that might have been approval. Chief Nalish comes at sunrise, he announced. He will decide if blood debt covers women's defiance. You will wait. The longest night of Ezekiel's life stretched ahead like a death sentence waiting for dawn. After the warriors disappeared into the darkness, he helped Ayanna change her sister's bandages by lamplight. Idil's wound had stopped bleeding, but infection remained a real threat. The torn flesh along her ribs looked angry and swollen, though she never complained. "Will he kill me?" Ezekiel asked quietly, watching Ayanna work with practiced hands. "Your Chief Nalish is fair man," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "But his son has many friends among warriors. They say marriage to Il would bring peace between clans." She paused, testing the tightness of a knot. Peace worth more than one white man's life. The brutal honesty hit harder than any threat. Ezekiel understood politics. He'd seen how quickly alliances shifted when survival was at stake. His death might be the price of tribal harmony. "Why did she refuse?" he asked, nodding toward it, who dozed fitfully against the cabin wall. Ayanna's expression hardened. "Chief's son took 3 wives, already beat 2, until they lost babies. Itself saw what happens to women who cannot say no." She met his eyes directly. "Some things worse than death." They worked in silence after that, the weight of morning pressing down like storm clouds. Outside, coyotes called across the valley, their voices sharp with hunger. Ezekiel found himself counting the hours, wondering if he'd live to hear them again. Near midnight, Idil stirred awake, her fever finally breaking. She spoke softly to her sister in Apache, then turned to Ezekiel with clear, intelligent eyes. "Thank you," she said in careful English, "for helping when help brings danger. Anyone would have done the same." Ezekiel replied. Both women exchanged a look that suggested otherwise. "White men help Apache before." Idil continued slowly. "But never risk life for women who bring trouble. You different." Ayanna stood, moving to the window to check the horizon. "Different may be why you still alive when Chief comes. Maybe why he listened to daughter's words about rivermen. Or maybe why he kills me quick instead of slow," Ezekiel said, trying for humor, but hearing the fear in his own voice. Ayanna turned back to him, and in the lamplight, he caught something in her expression that made his breath catch. Not pity or gratitude, but recognition. As if she saw something in him that he didn't see in himself. "It's Elle and I. We watch you tonight. Watch how you move, how you think, how you choose." She stepped closer. Close enough that he could smell sage in her hair and see the strength in her dark eyes. "You not like other white men we know." The observation hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Ezekiel felt heat rise in his chest, an attraction he had no right to feel. With death approaching at sunrise, a sound outside made them all freeze, horses moving slow and steady through the darkness. Too early for the chief, but too late for friendly visitors. Ayanna pressed against the window, her body tense as a drawn bowring. 3 riders, not Apache, her voice dropped to urgent whisper, white men with badges. Ezekiel's stomach turned to ice. If settlers had discovered Apache women in his cabin, morning's confrontation with Chief Nalish would be the least of his worries. Outside, a familiar voice called through the night. "Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out slow, hands where we can see them." Deputy Marshal William Kane stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow like a warning. Behind him, 2 other lawmen spread out across Ezekiel's yard, their hands resting on their gun belts with practiced ease. "Marsh, we got reports of Apache in this area," Kane announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Tracking party says they headed this direction after attacking the Morrison place." Ezekiel's blood went cold. If the Morrison ranch had been hit, settlers would be screaming for Apache blood. Any Apache found would be shot on sight, no questions asked. Behind him, he sensed Diana's massive frame tensing in the doorway. Nearly 7 FD of trained warrior ready to fight if necessary. Even wounded, she was more dangerous than all 3 lawmen combined. Idle remained motionless against the wall, but her giant form coiled with barely contained power despite her injuries. "Haven't seen any Apache," Ezekiel said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. His body felt small and inadequate, blocking the entrance. Knowing that 2 women, each capable of crushing these men with their bare hands, waited inside, Kane studied him with suspicious eyes. "That's so because there's blood on your porch, Marsh, fresh blood, and a lot of it." He gestured to one of his men, who immediately began examining the dark stains in the dirt. "Cut myself chopping wood." Ezekiel lied smoothly. "Axe slipped on wet wood, caught my arm." "Show me the cut," Kane demanded. Ezekiel's mind raced. He could fake an injury, maybe use his knife to create a fresh wound, but Kane was no fool. A federal marshal would spot the difference between old blood and new, between injury and fabrication. Deputy called the man examining the blood stains. "This ain't from one person. Different patterns, different amounts. And these footprints," he pointed to impressions in the mud. "These are huge, bigger than any settler I've seen." Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied the massive footprints that clearly belonged to the giant Apache sisters. "What kind of people you've been hosting here, Marsh?" "Don't know what you mean," Ezekiel replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Kane drew his pistol. "Step away from that door. We're searching your place." "You got a warrant?" Ezekiel asked. Though he knew it didn't matter out here. Federal marshals made their own law, especially when hunting Apache. "Don't need one for Indian killers," Kane replied coldly. "Stand aside." Ezekiel knew he had seconds before they discovered Ayanna and Syl. Once that happened, all 3 of them were dead. The giant women for being Apache, him for harboring enemies of the territory. But as Kane stepped toward the door, Ezekiel made a desperate decision. "Wait," he called out. "You're right, there are Apache here. 2 women badly injured, they came seeking help." Kane's gun swung toward him. "You admit to harboring hostiles. I admit to helping 2 dying human beings," Ezekiel said firmly. "Same as I do for anyone else." The marshal's face twisted with disgust. "Apache sympathizer, you'll hang for this, Marsh." Behind the door, Ezekiel heard movement. The giant sisters preparing for battle. But before anyone could act, one of Kane's men called out urgently from the ridge. "Marshal riders approaching from the north. Too dark to see how many." Kane spun toward the sound, his weapon forgotten for the moment. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. "Could be more Apache," Kane muttered, then raised his voice to his men. "Defensive positions. We'll settle with Marsh after we see who's coming." As the lawmen scrambled for cover, Ezekiel realized that reinforcements were arriving, but whether they came as salvation or doom would depend entirely on who rode through the darkness toward his cabin. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, carrying with it the weight of judgment that would arrive with the dawn. The riders that appeared in the darkness weren't Apache. They were more federal agents, reinforcements that Kane had called for backup. "Marshal Kine," the lead rider called out, dismounting quickly, "we've got orders from the territorial governor. All Apache harbored by settlers are to be brought in for questioning about the Morrison killings." Kane's confidence returned with the additional support. Now, 6 armed lawmen surrounded Ezekiel's property, making resistance impossible. "Search every building," Kane ordered. "Bring out anyone you find." Ezekiel's heart pounded as he realized his confession had doomed them all. Within minutes, Ayanna and Idle would be discovered, and all three of them would be dead or imprisoned. But Ayanna surprised everyone by stepping out of the cabin voluntarily, her massive frame filling the doorway. Before she emerged into the lamplight, even the hardened marshals stepped back involuntarily. None had ever seen an Apache woman of her size and bearing. She carried herself like royalty, her nearly 7 FT frame moving with deadly grace despite her injuries. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nalish," she announced in clear English. "This man saved my sister's life when she was dying. Apache law protects those who show mercy to our people." Itzel followed her sister outside, her own imposing height and muscled frame, making the marshals exchange nervous glances. These weren't ordinary Apache women. They were giants among their people, trained warriors who could kill with their bare hands. Kane raised his rifle toward the sisters. "Apache law doesn't mean anything to federal marshals. You're coming with us." "No," Ayanna said simply, her deep voice carrying absolute authority. "We are not." "You don't have a choice," Kane replied, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Something about these giant women's confidence suggested they knew something he didn't. Ayanna smiled, a cold expression that reminded Ezekiel of her father. "My father comes at sunrise. He will speak for us then. Until sunrise, we remain under protection of blood debt owed to this man." "What blood debt?" Kane demanded. Idle stepped forward, her massive frame casting shadows across the yard. 3 moons ago, White Rancher saved Chief's youngest daughter from drowning. Apache law says life debt must be honored. This man called in debt tonight when he helped us. The marshals exchanged glances. They had heard of Apache blood debts, sacred obligations that even war parties honored, but they had never encountered a situation where a white settler could claim such protection. "That's Indian superstition," Kane said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Federal law supersedes tribal customs, does it?" Ayanna asked quietly. "Then explain why territorial governor signed treaty last winter recognizing Apache legal customs in matters involving tribal members." Kane's face went pale. The treaty was real, a political necessity to avoid all-out war. If these women were really Chief Nalish's daughters, and if Ezekiel could prove he'd saved another daughter, then federal law would be forced to recognize the blood debt until the chief himself could rule on it. "We'll wait until morning," Kane finally said. "But if your father doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal requirements, all 3 of you are coming with us." As the marshals established a perimeter around the property, Ezekiel realized that everything now depended on what Chief Nalish would decide when he arrived with the sun. The giant sisters had bought them one night, but morning would bring judgment that could mean life or death. For all of them, Ayanna moved closer to Ezekiel, her imposing presence both protective and comforting. "Father is wise man," she said quietly, "but wisdom sometimes requires difficult choices." Looking at the armed men surrounding his property, Ezekiel understood that Chief Nalish's decision wouldn't just determine their fate. It would set precedent for how Apache and federal law interacted on the frontier. As the long night wore on, all they could do was wait for sunrise and hope that wisdom would prove stronger than politics. When judgment finally came, dawn broke with the sound of approaching horses, exactly as Ayanna had promised. Ezekiel stood in his doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night spent watching federal marshals patrol his property. The giant sisters had maintained their vigil beside him, their imposing frame serving as both protection and reminder of what was at stake. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, rifle ready as dust clouds appeared on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called to Ayanna, "because if it's a war party, we'll start shooting." Ayanna straightened to her full intimidating height, her nearly 7 FD of trained muscle casting a long shadow in the morning light. "My father comes as promised. He will speak Apache law and federal law both." The riders materialized from the dust, not the massive war party Kane had feared, but Chief Nelnish with a carefully chosen group of 5 elders, their faces painted for formal ceremony. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to show respect for both Apache tradition and federal authority. Chief Nalish dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Ezekiel had expected, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the lean strength of a survivor. Most striking were his eyes, intelligent, calculating, and completely unintimidated by the armed marshals surrounding him. Marshal Kane, the chief, said in perfect English, somehow knowing the lawman's name, "You hold my daughters as prisoners. This creates problem between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "Your daughters murdered settlers at the Morrison place. They're wanted for questioning under federal law. Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters." Chief Nalish replied with dangerous calm. "They defended their honor. Apache law justifies their actions. Federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving tribal members." The legal chess match had begun. Ezekiel watched as 2 experienced negotiators circled each other with words instead of weapons, each seeking advantage through law rather than force. "Even if that's true," Kane said, "harboring fugitives is a federal crime. This rancher broke the law helping them." Chief Nalish turned his attention to Ezekiel, studying him with intense focus. "You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from drowning in the creek." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel managed, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. "For this, Apache law says I owe you blood debt. Life for life." The chief's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. "But you also saved 2 more of my daughters when they were dying. This makes debt very complicated." Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, her massive frame both protective and supportive. "Chief," she said formally, "this man risked everything to help us. He is worthy of Apache respect." Chief Nalish nodded slowly, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made everyone go still. A necklace of carved bone and silver, the kind worn only by Apache family members of the highest rank. 3 lives saved creates obligation beyond simple blood debt, the chief announced, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. "Ezekiel Marsh, you have proven yourself worthy of adoption into Apache family. You become my son through deed and honor." Kane's rifle trembled in his hands. "You can't just declare American territory as Indian land. The federal government recognizes treaty rights." Chief Nalish interrupted smoothly. "Treaty says Apache can adopt members, claim family lands. Your own law protects adopted Apache family members from persecution." The brilliance of the decision struck Ezekiel like lightning. In one move, the chief had solved every problem. Protection for his daughters, legal immunity for Ezekiel, and a way to claim valuable ranch land under federal treaty law. "Ezekiel Marsh," Chief Nalish continued, "do you accept adoption? Do you take my daughters as your sisters, my people as your people?" Looking at Ayanna and Idil, 2 giant warriors who had trusted him with their lives, Ezekiel realized this was more than legal protection. It was transformation, belonging, and the chance to bridge 2 worlds that had only known war. "I accept," he said clearly. Chief Nalish stepped forward and placed the necklace around Ezekiel's neck. The weight of it felt like chains and freedom combined. Kane holstered his weapon with obvious frustration, knowing he had been outmaneuvered completely. This isn't over. "There will be federal investigations. Let them come," Chief Nalish said with quiet confidence. "Apache law is clear. Federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and daughters are under tribal protection now." But as the chief prepared to leave with his elders, he turned back to Ezekiel with something that might have been amusement in his ancient eyes. "Son," he said quietly, "tomorrow I return with different decision. Tonight, think carefully about what adoption truly means." The next day, Chief Nalish returned with the decision that would change everything forever. Ezekiel stood in his yard, still wearing the adoption necklace that had made him Apache family. Still uncertain what the chief's cryptic words about different decision had meant. Beside him, Ayanna towered in all her 7th glory, her massive frame casting shadows across